Number 1. Cecco d'Ascoli. On September 16th, 1327, a crowd gathered in a Florentine square to watch a university professor burn. He was tied to a wooden stake, and beside his feet his own book was set alight with him. His name was Francesco Stabili, though history remembers him as Cecco d'Ascoli. He had been born around 1257, and he had risen to hold the chair of astrology and astronomy at the University of Bologna. You have to understand what that meant. In the medieval university, astrology was a licensed science. Physicians used it. Kings funded it. It sat beside medicine and mathematics as a respectable field of study. Cecco was not a street fortune teller. He was a tenured scholar at one of Europe's greatest universities. So how did a professor of the stars end up burning beside his own writing? The trouble began with a commentary he wrote on a standard astronomy textbook, the Treatise on the Sphere by Johannes de Sacrobosco. In that commentary, Cecco pushed a dangerous idea. He argued that the stars did not merely influence human life. They compelled it. He suggested that even the life of Christ had been governed by a horoscope, and that demons acted through the celestial spheres. To the Church, this was a direct attack. If the stars fixed all fate, then human free will vanished, and so did the will of God. In 1324, the Bolognese Inquisition condemned him, fined him, and forbade him to teach astrology. He left Bologna and became court astrologer in Florence to Charles of Calabria, the son of Robert of Anjou, the king of Naples, so he had landed a powerful patron. But he had made enemies too, among them the physician Dino del Garbo, a professional rival, and the inquisitor Accursio. In the tight, jealous world of a medieval court, enemies like these were deadly. They reopened his case. Under medieval law, a second offense made him a relapsed heretic, and the punishment for that was death. The mainstream view is straightforward. Cecco was executed for genuine doctrinal heresy, for a theory that erased divine free will. But historians note that personal rivalries and court politics sharpened the blade considerably. And there is a darker reading, that a man who claimed to predict fate itself frightened those in power who did not want the future read. His unfinished masterwork was a sprawling poem called La Cerba, meant to rival Dante's Divine Comedy, packed with astronomy, meteorology, mineralogy, and natural philosophy. In it, he attacked Dante's cosmology directly, and here is the irony. Once the printing press arrived, La Cerba was printed again and again. The man was ash, but his forbidden book spread across Europe. Cecco was not the last thinker killed for writing down the wrong picture of the heavens. Number 2. Al-Suhrawardi, the murdered. Some scholars are remembered for their ideas. This one is remembered by a name that records his death. In Arabic, he is called Al-Maktul, which means the killed one, the murdered. He was born in 1154 in the Persian town of Suhraward, and he was dead by 1191, at roughly 36 years old. In that short life, he founded an entire school of philosophy. It is called Illuminationism, and its central claim is strange and beautiful. Suhrawardi argued that the fundamental reality of the universe is not being, but light. Everything that exists is a gradation of light and darkness, and the highest reality is a light of lights. His masterwork, completed in 1186, laid this out in full. He drew on the philosophy of Avicenna, on Plato, and on the ancient Persian metaphysics of light, and he fused them into something new. He distinguished between ordinary reasoning and a higher, intuitive knowledge attained through inner purification. He described an intermediate realm between pure thought and physical matter, a world of images, an idea philosophers still discuss today. He reinterpreted the light entities of old Zoroastrian religion as Platonic archetypes. To a young philosopher, this was thrilling. To the orthodox religious scholars of his time, it was terrifying. Suhrawardi traveled through Persia and Anatolia before settling in Aleppo, at the court of a son of the great Sultan Saladin. There his brilliance and his charisma drew students and drew suspicion. The orthodox jurists accused him of heresy, of dangerous secret teachings, of claims that came close to prophethood. They took their complaint to Saladin himself, and Saladin had just recaptured Jerusalem. He needed to look like a defender of orthodox faith. So he ordered his son to put the philosopher to death. The sources disagree on how it was done, whether by strangulation, by starvation in a cell, or by the sword. The mainstream reading is that his ideas genuinely threatened religious authority. Others point to Saladin's political need to please the clergy after the Crusades. And some suggest his reputed mystical powers frightened rivals into demanding his death. His philosophy was suppressed in his lifetime, but it did not die. Centuries later, thinkers in Safavid Persia, above all the great philosopher Mulla Sadra, revived and built upon his illuminationist ideas, and in the 20th century, the French scholar Henry Corbin rescued his works for the modern world, editing them and presenting Suhrawardi as a bridge between ancient Zoroastrian Persia and Islamic philosophy. So the young man executed in a citadel at 36 ended up shaping thought for the next 800 years. At least his name survived. The next author on this list has none at all. Number 3. The Voynich Manuscript author. Here is a genuine impossibility. We have the book. We can hold it, scan it, and study every page. But we cannot read a single word of it, and we do not know who wrote it. The Voynich Manuscript is a codex of about 240 pages of vellum, now held at Yale University's Beinecke Library, catalogued as Manuscript 408. In 2009, radiocarbon dating placed the animal skin pages between 1404 and 1438, the early 15th century. So the object is real, and it is old. Everything else is a mystery. The manuscript is written in an unknown script, sometimes called Voynichese, made of roughly 20 to 30 distinct symbols. No confirmed language, no confirmed cipher, no accepted translation has ever been produced. The pages are filled with drawings. There are botanical sections showing plants that match no known species. There are astronomical diagrams, strange circular charts, images of women bathing in green pools, and pages of what look like pharmaceutical recipes. It is named for Wilfrid Voynich, a book dealer who bought it in 1912, and who promoted the idea that the medieval scholar Roger Bacon had written it. Radiocarbon dating later destroyed that claim, though Bacon appears later on our own list. Its trail runs backward through the court of Emperor Rudolf II in Prague, passing through owners like Georg Barisch and the physician Jan Marek Marcy, and finally into the hands of the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, who was famous for claiming he could decode ancient Egyptian. Even Kircher, it seems, could make nothing of it. The manuscript is carefully made, with fold-out pages, including a large diagram of 9 connected circles that scholars call the rosettes, so whoever made it invested real labor and real skill. This was not a careless scribble, and the greatest codebreakers in the world have failed against it. William Friedman, the American cryptologist who broke Japan's purple cipher in the Second World War, spent years on the Voynich and never cracked it. Statistical analysis in 2013 found that the text follows patterns found in real languages, which argues against simple gibberish. Ink and pigment analysis found materials consistent with the period, which argues against a modern forgery. So, what is it? The mainstream guess is a genuine but encrypted reference work of herbs, medicine, and cosmology. Others think it an elaborate hoax sold to a gullible emperor, and some believe it is deliberately hidden knowledge, a code whose key died with its maker. That is the purest form of a forbidden book. Knowledge locked away, and the author gone. Some authors, though, hid their science as magic entirely on purpose. Number 4. Johannes Trithemius. Imagine a book that appears to teach you how to summon spirits and send messages through them across great distances. Now, imagine that the spirits are fake, and the real content is a secret code. That is the book that got Johannes Trithemius branded a sorcerer. He was born in 1462, a German Benedictine monk who became abbot of Sponheim, and he died in 1516. As abbot, he built one of the greatest libraries in Europe, some 2,000 volumes, and that vast collection of books only deepened the rumors that he trafficked with dark powers. Around 1499, he wrote the work that would haunt his name. On its surface, it was a manual for communicating with the aid of spirits. But the first two books are not magic at all. They are cryptography, a method of hiding secret messages disguised as spirit conjuration. The names of the so-called spirits actually encode the cipher. The very word steganography, the art of hidden writing, comes from his title. The third book's code was so well hidden that it was only fully cracked in the 1990s, revealing hidden cryptographic and astrological content. In 1509, long after his death, the church placed the work on its list of prohibited books. But Trithemius was not only a mystifier. In 1508, he wrote what became the first printed book on cryptography in Europe. In it, he laid out a grid, a table of shifting alphabets, that became the ancestor of one of the most important encryption methods in history. There is a direct line from this monk to modern digital encryption, and even the historian David Kahn, in his Great History of Codes, credits Trithemius as a founding father of Western cryptology. His students included two other men on the edges of our story, the notorious Agrippa and the rebel physician Paracelsus, so his influence spread through the most controversial minds of the age. So, which was he? The mainstream view is a misunderstood cryptographer wrongly accused of magic. Others argue he cultivated the magical reputation deliberately, as camouflage for real and valuable secrets. And a few suspect the spirit framework hid knowledge that truly was considered dangerous. A monk invents encryption, and the world calls him a Satanist. His most famous student would be hunted across an entire continent. Number 5. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. Picture a scholar who could never stay in one city. Cologne, Paris, London, Turin, Metz, Geneva, Lyon. He moved constantly, often one step ahead of the men who wanted to burn his book. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa was born in Cologne in 1486 and died in 1535. He was a physician, a lawyer, a soldier, and above all the author of the most notorious book of magic of the entire Renaissance. He had studied under Trithemius, who gave him a clear warning to keep the dangerous work secret and share it only with trusted friends. Agrippa drafted that work around 1510, though he did not fully publish it until the 1530s. It was a 3-book synthesis of natural magic, celestial magic, and ceremonial magic, weaving together Neoplatonism, Jewish Kabbalah, and Hermetic philosophy into one grand system for manipulating the cosmos. To the theologians of Louvain and the Sorbonne, it was a manual for tampering with forces no man should touch, and they condemned it. Strangely, Agrippa also wrote a second book that attacked all human learning as uncertain and vain, which offended people from the opposite direction. In the town of Metz, he defended a woman accused of witchcraft against the local inquisitor, and it cost him his position. He also served as physician to Louise of Savoy, the mother of the French king Francis I, and later as archivist to the Emperor Charles V. So this was a man who moved through the highest courts of Europe, even as theologians hunted his book. His life ran downhill from there. He fell into debt, spent time in prison, and died in obscurity in 1535, the exact place and circumstances of his death still uncertain, which is itself part of why he belongs on a list of scholars who effectively vanished. After he was gone, legends grew. People whispered that he had kept a black dog as a demon familiar, and a fake 4th book of magic was published under his name to feed the myth. The mainstream reading is a serious scholar destroyed by censors. But his own skepticism, his book attacking all knowledge, shows a far more conflicted man who may have doubted the very magic he cataloged. And of course, some insisted he truly practiced forbidden arts and paid for it. To find the oldest disappearance of all, we go back nearly 2,000 years. Number 6. Empedocles of Acragas. This is antiquity's most spectacular vanishing act. A philosopher who, by legend, climbed to the rim of an active volcano and walked into the fire to prove he was a god. Empedocles lived in the Greek city of Acragas, in Sicily, from about 494 to 434 BC. He was one of the most important thinkers before Socrates, and his ideas shaped science for 2,000 years. He proposed that all matter is made of 4 roots: earth, water, air, and fire. He added 2 cosmic forces, which he called love and strife, that endlessly combine and separate these elements. That 4-element theory would dominate Western science until the scientific revolution. He wrote his philosophy in verse, in grand hexameter poems, and only fragments survive. In the 1990s, a remarkable papyrus discovery in Strasbourg added new fragments and reshaped how scholars understand his cosmology. Buried in his ideas was something that sounds startlingly modern, a notion that living creatures were once assembled from separate parts, and that the unfit forms perished, an ancient shadow of natural selection. But Empedocles was not a modest researcher. He announced himself to cities as an immortal god. Stories credited him with reviving a woman who had not breathed for 30 days, and with stopping a plague by diverting rivers. And then he vanished. The biographer Diogenes Laertius recorded the famous tale that Empedocles leapt into the crater of Mount Etna, either to prove his divinity or to disappear so completely that people would believe he had ascended. The volcano, the story goes, betrayed him by throwing back one of his bronze sandals, exposing the trick. Other accounts have him drowning or dying quietly in Greece. The contradictions are part of the legend. The mainstream view treats the Etna leap as a symbolic myth. Others read it as a staged disappearance, meant to cement a divine reputation. And some see his secret doctrines and claimed powers as a kind of hidden knowledge he guarded closely. Whatever the truth, he became the model of the scientist who simply walks off the edge of history. His influence far outlasted the mystery of his death. The great philosopher Aristotle credited him as the inventor of rhetoric, and the physician Galen counted him among the founders of medicine in Italy. His 4 elements were absorbed into Aristotle's system and ruled European science for nearly 2,000 years, until chemistry finally replaced them. In the 19th century, the English poet Matthew Arnold wrote a long poem imagining the philosopher's final thoughts at the crater's edge, cementing the romantic image of the leap. The next man's real discovery burned with his book. Number 7. Michael Servetus. This is the cruelest case on the list, because here a genuine scientific breakthrough was destroyed almost by accident. Michael Servetus was a Spanish physician born around 1509 or 1511. He was the first person in Europe to correctly describe how blood passes through the lungs, the pulmonary circulation, decades before William Harvey mapped the circulation of the blood. It was a real discovery, a true advance in human anatomy, but Servetus did not publish it in a medical journal. He buried it inside a theology book. That book, published in 1553, was called The Restoration of Christianity. In it, Servetus rejected the doctrine of the Trinity and rejected infant baptism. That made him a heretic to Catholics and Protestants alike. He had been writing, under a false name, to the reformer John Calvin, and he had even sent Calvin a manuscript. Calvin turned against him completely. The Catholic Inquisition arrested Servetus in France, and he escaped, and they burned him in effigy. Then, fleeing toward Italy, he made an inexplicable decision. He stopped in Geneva, Calvin's own city, was recognized at a sermon and was arrested again. The trial in Geneva had Calvin as his chief accuser. Servetus was convicted of heresy, and on October 27, 1553, he was burned alive, with a copy of his book chained to his leg. Nearly every copy of that book was hunted down and destroyed. Today, only 3 original copies are known to survive in the entire world. Because the book was erased, the discovery of pulmonary circulation inside it was lost and had to be found again later by others. The mainstream view is that real science was destroyed as collateral damage in a theological war. Others emphasize the personal hatred between Servetus and Calvin, and some note that a man who commanded both medicine and theology was doubly dangerous. His death also lit a different fire. A scholar named Sebastian Castellio wrote a furious response, arguing that to kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, but simply to kill a man. That single sentence became one of the founding statements of the modern idea of religious tolerance. So Servetus lost his life and very nearly lost his discovery, but his death helped plant the seed of a freedom we now take for granted. He had also worked as an editor in Lyon and produced an edition of the ancient geographer Ptolemy, a reminder that these were rounded scholars, not narrow specialists. The next rebel burned his rival's books before his own were ever banned. Number 8. Paracelsus. Some scientists quietly disagree with authority. This one built a bonfire. In 1527, at the University of Basel, a physician named Paracelsus publicly burned the sacred medical texts of Galen and Avicenna, the ancient authorities that all of European medicine was built upon. It was an act of open rebellion, and it tells you everything about the man. Born near Einsiedeln in Switzerland in 1493, Paracelsus transformed medicine by dragging chemistry into it. He insisted that specific minerals and chemical substances could treat disease, founding the field we call iatrochemistry. His most famous principle still governs pharmacology today. The dose makes the poison. A substance is harmful or helpful depending only on how much you use. That bonfire got him driven out of Basel, and he spent much of his life wandering. He broke another rule by writing in German rather than scholarly Latin, so ordinary people could read him. His great surgery book, published in 1536, restored his fame late in life. He named the metal zinc. He wrote one of the first studies of the diseases that afflicted miners, an early work of occupational medicine. He introduced chemical remedies drawn from mercury, sulfur, and antimony, treatments that were genuinely new and genuinely dangerous in the wrong hands. But many of his medical and especially his theological writings were banned or censored, and much of his work circulated only in handwritten copies, published only after his death. Later esoteric movements, including the Rosicrucians, would claim him as an ancestor, and centuries later, the psychologist Carl Jung would read him as a pioneer of the inner, symbolic world. And his death is its own mystery. In 1541, in Salzburg, Paracelsus died suddenly at about 47. The theories multiply. Some say a violent brawl, some say a fall, some say natural illness, and some say he was poisoned by rival physicians who hated the man who had burned their books. A 20th century examination of his skull found possible abnormalities but could not settle the cause. The mainstream reading is a natural or accidental death of a hard-living traveler. Others suspect murder by threatened enemies, and some tie his end to alchemical and theological knowledge deemed too dangerous. There's a grim symmetry here. He burned the books of the ancients, and his own books were burned in turn. The next scientist did not burn his dangerous knowledge. He encrypted it. Number 9. Roger Bacon. Long before gunpowder reshaped warfare in Europe, a Franciscan friar wrote its formula down, and then he hid it, deliberately, inside a coded puzzle. His name was Roger Bacon, and later ages called him Dr. Mirabilis, the wonderful teacher. He was born in Somerset, in England, around 1219, and he became one of the earliest European champions of the experimental method, the idea that knowledge comes from observation and testing rather than from authority alone. He studied optics deeply, working out the behavior of lenses, the bending of light, the anatomy of the eye, and the formation of the rainbow. He speculated about telescopes, about flying machines, and about self-powered vehicles, centuries before any of them existed. Around 1267, at the secret request of Pope Clement IV, Bacon produced 3 great works summarizing his science. Inside one of his writings, he recorded a formula related to gunpowder, but he wrote the key part as a scrambled anagram, hiding the dangerous knowledge in plain sight. He also argued for reforming the calendar based on careful astronomical observation, 300 years before the calendar was actually fixed. But in 1268, his protector, the Pope, died, and Bacon lost his shield. Sometime around 1277 or 1278, his own Franciscan order is said to have condemned him and placed him under house arrest for suspected novelties. Those novelties likely included his interest in astrology, alchemy, and prophecy, all viewed with deep suspicion. Historians debate how harsh his confinement really was, and some think the imprisonment story grew in the retelling. Either way, his works were treated cautiously and partly suppressed within his order. Legend later turned him into a wizard who built a talking brass head of bronze that could answer any question, a folk memory of a man who seemed to know too much. There is something telling in that legend. When a real thinker races too far ahead of his age, later generations often cannot tell his science from sorcery, and they reach for magic to explain him. The mainstream view is a genuine early scientist, constrained by a fearful institution. Others say the prison story is exaggerated, and some suspect he was silenced for knowledge, optics, and gunpowder that carried real military power. It is worth noting that the Voynich Manuscript was once wrongly pinned on him, tying 2 of our mysteries together. The next thinker refused to hide anything at all, and he burned for it. Number 10. Giordano Bruno. Now we reach a name many of you will know. On February 17th, 1600, in the Roman square called the Campo dei Fiori, a former monk was burned alive for imagining that the universe is infinite. His name was Giordano Bruno, born near Naples in 1548. He had entered the Dominican order as a young man, but his mind ran far beyond its walls. Bruno argued that the universe has no center and no edge, that it stretches out infinitely, and that it contains countless worlds. He said the stars were distant suns, and that those suns might be circled by their own inhabited planets. He took the new idea of Copernicus, that the Earth orbits the sun, and pushed it into a vision of infinite space that still feels startlingly modern. He could not stay safe in Italy. Suspected of heresy, he fled his order in 1576 and wandered across Europe for years, lecturing in France, in England at Oxford, and in Germany. His books with titles like On the Infinite Universe and Worlds made him famous and dangerous. Then, in 1591, he was lured back to Italy. The Venetian Inquisition arrested him, and he was handed over to the Roman Inquisition, which interrogated him for 7 long years. Before his return, he had lectured widely, teaching his famous systems for training the memory and debating natural philosophy at Oxford, where his ideas met a frosty reception. The charges against him in Rome combined his denial of core Christian doctrines, the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, and transubstantiation, with his cosmology of infinite worlds. He would not fully recant. When his judges finally condemned him, he is said to have told them that they pronounced the sentence with greater fear than he felt in receiving it, a line that has echoed through the centuries as an emblem of intellectual courage. He was burned in the public square, hung upside down, and his tongue was restrained so he could not address the crowd. His books were placed on the list of prohibited works and burned. For a long time, he was remembered as a pure martyr of science. Modern historians complicate that, pointing out that his motives were deeply mystical and hermetic, not simply astronomical. And some see his death as the destruction of a man who threatened the cosmic order that power depended on. In 1889, nearly 3 centuries after his death, a statue of Bruno was raised on the exact spot where he had burned, in the Campo dei Fiori, where it still stands today amid a busy market. It became a lasting symbol of the right to think freely and to say what you believe about the cosmos. Few figures capture the theme of this video so completely. A man who looked up at the night sky, saw further than his age could bear, and was destroyed for describing it. The next scholar was not executed by a court. She was torn apart by a mob. Number 11. Hypatia of Alexandria. In the city of Alexandria, in March of the year 415, one of the ancient world's greatest mathematicians was dragged from her chariot and murdered in the street. Her name was Hypatia. She had been born in Alexandria somewhere between 350 and 370, and she led the Platonist school of philosophy in that great city of learning. She was a mathematician, an astronomer, and a philosopher. Her father was the mathematician Theon, and she worked alongside him, producing commentaries on the hardest mathematical texts of the age, the works of Diophantus, of Apollonius, and the astronomical tables of Ptolemy. Her students remembered her with awe. One of them, Synesius, who later became a Christian bishop, wrote letters that survive, crediting her with helping design scientific instruments, an improved astrolabe for tracking the stars, and a device for measuring the density of liquids. She taught students of every background, pagan and Christian alike, and one of them, Synesius, thought so highly of her that his admiring letters became one of our most important windows into her life. She was that rare thing in the ancient world, a woman who lectured in public, advised city officials, and moved freely as a respected intellectual, and that visibility placed her in the middle of a deadly political conflict between Orestes, the Roman governor of Egypt, and Cyril, the powerful Christian patriarch of the city. Both men were fighting for control of Alexandria, and Hypatia, as a friend of the governor, became a target in a struggle that was really about power. A rumor spread that Hypatia was using her influence, even sorcery, to prevent the two men from reconciling. In March of 415, a mob of zealots seized her. They dragged her to a church, stripped her, killed her, scraped at her body with broken pottery and tiles, and burned her remains. Her death is often described as the symbolic end of Alexandria's long tradition of scholarship. Almost all of her own writing is lost. We know her mostly through her father's collaborations and through references by others. A near-contemporary Christian historian, Socrates Scholasticus, recorded the murder and condemned it. The mainstream reading is a political killing that exploited religious tension. Others emphasize the patriarch's factional power struggle, and some feel her scientific knowledge itself marked her as a pagan threat to be erased. The last name on our list may never have died at all. Number 12. Nicolas Flamel. We end with a man who was entirely real and whose real story was rewritten by a forbidden book into a legend of immortality. Nicolas Flamel was born in the French town of Pontoise around 1330, and he died in Paris in 1418. The historical Flamel was not a wizard. He was a scribe, a seller of manuscripts, and a notary working near a church in the heart of Paris. He married a widow named Perenelle, and together the couple became notably wealthy. In their own time, they were known as generous donors, funding chapels, hospitals, and religious foundations across the city. So, where does the magic come from? Nearly 200 years after Flamel died, in 1612, a book appeared under his name, called the Book of Hieroglyphic Figures. It told a wonderful story. It claimed that Flamel had acquired a mysterious ancient text, the Book of Abraham the Jew, written on pages of bark and filled with cryptic diagrams. It claimed he had spent years deciphering it, and had finally achieved the two great goals of alchemy, the philosopher's stone, which turns metal into gold, and the elixir of life, which grants immortality. Notice how that lost book of bark and strange diagrams echoes the Voynich Manuscript from earlier. Modern scholars are confident that Flamel did not write this 1612 book at all. It was the work of a 17th century author using his name. And from that book grew the strangest legend of all, that Flamel and Paracelsus had never truly died. The story said they had faked their deaths and slipped away to live in secret for centuries. People reported seeing him alive well into the 16 and 1700s in Paris, and even, supposedly, in India. Serious scientists, including Isaac Newton, studied the Flamel legend closely because in their day, alchemy was not a joke, but a frontier of natural knowledge. Newton filled notebooks with alchemical study, and the story of a scribe who had supposedly succeeded was too tempting to ignore. Meanwhile, the real evidence of the man remained. His tombstone, which he designed himself, survives in a Paris museum, and one of the oldest stone houses in the city, built in 1407, was his. The mainstream view is a wealthy scribe mythologized long after death. Others credit 17th century publishers with manufacturing the immortality legend, and a few still wonder if he truly found the stone and truly disappeared. In every story on this list, the forbidden book outlived the author who wrote it. So what actually made a book forbidden across so many centuries and cultures? Look at the 12 stories together, and a clear pattern appears. In every case, the knowledge threatened power, whether religious, political, or professional. Some of it was cosmology that displaced humanity or God from the center of things. The infinite worlds of Bruno, the star-ruled fate of Cecco, the divine claims of Empedocles. Some of it was metaphysics and theology that denied official doctrine, the light philosophy of Al-Suhrawardi, the anti-Trinity arguments of Servetus. Some of it was occult or cryptographic knowledge that looked like sorcery, the coded books of Trithemius, Agrippa, and Bacon. And some of it was medical and chemical disruption that overturned established authority, the chemistry of Paracelsus, and the anatomy of Servetus. The tools of suppression were consistent, too. After the printing press arrived around the middle of the 1400s, ideas could spread faster than ever, which made authors both more powerful and more exposed. The church built a formal machinery of censorship, a list of prohibited books first established in 1559 to hunt dangerous texts. And it is crucial to see that heresy and science were not separate categories yet. A single book could be both at once. Faced with this danger, scholars developed defenses. Some encrypted their knowledge, like Bacon hiding gunpowder in an anagram, or Trithemius disguising cryptography as spirit magic, so that the real content could only be reached by a trusted reader who held the key. Others used false names and constant flight, like Servetus, who lived for years under the identity of a man called Michel de Villeneuve, and Agrippa, who never stayed in one city for long. There is a grim logic to why the authorities so often burned the book alongside its author. Destroying the man was not enough. The idea lived in the pages, so the pages had to burn too. And burning the book alongside its author was no accident. It was a symbolic act, meant to erase the idea along with the man. Yet again and again, that same condemnation preserved and advertised the very ideas it meant to destroy. Which raises a harder question. How much knowledge simply vanished without leaving any trace at all? The real cost of all this suppression is difficult to measure, but we can see its shape. When Servetus was burned with his book, the discovery of pulmonary circulation went with him and had to be made again by others years later. That is a delay we can actually name. Roger Bacon's experimental method and optics were constrained and half forgotten, only to be rediscovered in the centuries that followed. Bruno's vision of an infinite universe of countless suns was condemned, and then slowly vindicated by modern astronomy long after his ashes had scattered. Suhrawardi's philosophy of light was crushed in his lifetime, then became foundational to later Persian thought. Hypatia's commentaries were mostly lost, surviving only in fragments and references. A general principle emerges from this. Suppression can delay a robust truth, but it rarely erases one permanently, because a strong idea tends to be rediscovered. The real, irreversible losses are the unique works, the single copies truly destroyed, and the anonymous authors erased so completely that no one even searched for them. That is the deepest tragedy of the Voynich author, a mind that produced an entire book and left no name behind. There is also a hidden problem here that historians call survivorship bias. We only know about the cases where records happen to survive. For every Bruno remembered by a statue, there may be dozens of thinkers silenced so thoroughly that history holds no memory of them at all. Fear itself became a drag on discovery, pushing knowledge underground into codes and secret societies. Consider Empedocles, whose poems survived only in scattered fragments until a papyrus discovered in Strasbourg in the 1990s suddenly gave scholars new lines to read, more than 2,000 years after he wrote them. That is how thin the thread of survival can be. A single buried sheet of papyrus can rewrite what we know of an ancient mind. It was only when scholars began banding together into scientific societies in the 1600s that the lone, vulnerable genius gained some protection, and knowledge became something an institution defended rather than a single body that could be burned. A society could not be tied to a stake. A journal could not be strangled in a cell. The shift from the endangered individual to the protected community may be one of the quiet turning points in the whole history of science. Look back across these 12 lives, and one thing binds them. Every single author was silenced, and yet in almost every case, the ideas endured. That is the quiet truth at the heart of this story. The book proved to be a more durable vessel than the body that made it. Cecco was ash, but his poem was printed across Europe. Servetus was burned, but 3 copies of his book still survive. Bruno's tongue was restrained, so he could not speak, and now a statue speaks for him in the square where he died. Fire was meant to erase these works, and again the fire only made them famous. The forbidden label became, in the end, a strange form of preservation. We should not lose the human tragedy beneath that survival. These were real people, burned, murdered, driven into exile, or vanished into legend at the height of their powers. There is a special ache in the Voynich author, a mind erased so completely that we cannot even mourn a name. And there is the strange inversion of Flamel, an ordinary scribe turned by a book into an immortal he never was. What this pattern tells us about power is simple. Authority fears the knowledge it cannot control. And what it tells us about knowledge is just as simple. Robust truth resurfaces, whatever is done to bury it. So much of it survived by pure chance, a single hidden copy changing the course of history. We owe an enormous debt to those who wrote dangerous things down anyway, knowing what it might cost them. The freedom to publish what you believe is a recent and fragile achievement. And it is worth asking yourself, quietly, which ideas of our own time are the forbidden books of tomorrow? The author goes missing. The writing remains.